So today we're going to start in on our unit about congruence. Now, just to remind you, congruent is when two things have the same shape and the same size, and we use this symbol, the equal sign with a little squiggle on top, to signify congruence. So what we're going to be talking about in this congruence lesson today is how to know if two things are congruent, and then if they are congruent, how we can state that in what we call a congruence statement. So let's take a look at this summary sheet right here. And there is another copy of this in your notes as well. Again, highlighted here is the notation we use for congruence. All right, so the equal with the squiggle on the top. And we have two different ways that we can notate that segments and angles are congruent. And I know we've talked about this before, but I just want to bring it up one more time. So we see that segments CD and AB are congruent because they both have this line through the middle of their segment, and that notates that they are congruent. We could also have a separate set of lines, say EF, GH. All right, now those could have two markings through them, meaning those are congruent to each other, but they are not congruent to these ones here. All right, so the number of markings in those segments make a difference. With our angles here, it's the same kind of idea, except it's a curved marking in the inside of the angle. So we see that both of these angles are 66 degrees, which means they are the same size. And they are both angles, so they're the same shape, so we can say that these angles are congruent to each other. All right, so here we have two segments that are congruent, so CD and AB, and we can see that in two different ways that they are congruent by the picture. We see that both of them have this congruence marking on them, so that says that they're congruent. We also see that we have this CD equals 7.1 and AB equals 7.1. So since they're the same size, we know that they're congruent. So we can write a congruency statement that tells us that these are congruent. So it would look something like this. CD, we have a segment over it because it is a line segment, is congruent to AB. All right, and that's how we would read this statement. So again, we put the little line over the top of CD and AB because they are line segments. That tells us, without even looking at a picture, if we were to just have this statement, that we would be talking about two line segments that are congruent. So now we're going to spend a little more time talking about these congruent statements. So if we look here, we have an example where it says triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Now, this is very important because the order does matter here in these congruency statements. The order in which they are named helps us to determine what pieces of the shape match up with each other. So which angles match up and which sides match up. So let's look at this congruent statement down here. It's the same statement. We're just now going to be using colors to kind of help us see a clearer picture of what's happening here. So again, we have triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. So what this tells me, the order of this, is that A is the first letter in the first triangle and D is the first letter in the second triangle. That tells me that angles A and D are congruent to each other. All right, B and E are the second letters in each of the triangles as they're listed. Those are congruent to each other. And then lastly, C and F are the last letters listed for each of those. That tells me those are congruent to each other. All right, so the order in which they are labeled tells us what they are congruent with. So we don't even need a picture to know that angles A and D are congruent, B and E are congruent, and C and F are congruent. Now we can also use this to help us determine what sides are congruent as well. So I'm going to erase this and we're going to start again. All right, so AB, first two letters together, that side is congruent to DE. All right, first two letters are congruent with the side of the first two letters. All right, let's see. The next two letters, BC, so side BC is congruent to EF. So that gray letter and blue letter, gray letter and blue letter, and you'll see that down here. And then lastly, we have our A and C. That's congruent to side DF. All right, so our yellow and our blue letter. Again, all this is pictured down here as well. All right, so the order does matter. So I could look at this statement, again, without the picture, and I could say, all right, I want to know what angle is congruent to angle C. All right, so I would look, C is the third letter in that first triangle, so I'd look for the third letter in the second triangle, and I would know that angle F is congruent to angle C. So below here is a picture of the two triangles, and you'll see that all of the congruency markings show the same things that we were talking about from this congruence statement. So angles A and D are congruent. They both have 1 mark through that angle. B and E are congruent with 2 marks through each angle. And C and F are congruent with 3 marks through the angle. All right, now we can do the same with the sides. AB and DE have 1 mark through each side. All right, AB, DE. And then we also have BC has 2 marks as well as EF. And again, it's following the same order that we had with those statements in the beginning. And then AC has 3 lines through that segment of the triangle, and so does DF. All right, so again, this is going to come from the congruence statement, or we could write a congruent statement from this picture. So we're going to do a little more practice with these different things that we just kind of talked about. All right, so let's take a look at this first example here. All right, so it says complete each congruence statement by naming the corresponding angle or side. So corresponding means what matches up. All right, so the thing in the same order. Okay, so here we have our congruence statement. Triangle WVU is congruent to triangle WLN. And we see that UW is the side we're looking at. All right, U was the last letter in that first triangle. So I'm going to start with the last letter in the second triangle, so N. And then the first letter, W. Put my segment line over. That would tell us that UW is congruent to NW. And we would be able to tell that from our congruent statement here because the order does matter. All right, let's look at the same kind of idea here, but now we're looking at an angle. So here's our congruent statement, and we want to know what angle Q is congruent to. Now, angle Q is that second letter, so we're going to look for the second letter in our second triangle, and we see that angle Q is congruent to angle W. All right. So let's do the same thing here. Now this time we just have a picture to go along with it as well. So we have that triangle MLK is congruent to triangle MXW. So we want to know what angle is congruent to angle L. Well, again, we see that's the second letter. So we're going to look at the second letter here, and that's angle X. So we could even mark off angle L is congruent to angle X. And looking at the same thing over here, we have our triangle statement here, our congruent statement. Triangle NLM is congruent to triangle MDC. And what is congruent to angle N? Again, angle N is the first letter, so we're going to look for the first letter in that second part of our statement. So that's going to be congruent to angle M. All right, we're going to continue to do the same thing. Now here, we do have all the congruence markings in our pictures. So you can use the picture or the statement. Either way, it's going to get you the same answer. So with this first problem, we have that we are looking for what segment is congruent to JL. All right, so JL is the second and third letter in the first part of our statement. So I know that that's going to be congruent to GH, the last two letters in our second part of our statement. And let's double check with our picture. So let's look for JL. All right, so JL is right here. So we're looking for the side that has two lines through that side. And look, that's GH. Okay, so again, whichever way you look at it, either with the statement or the picture, they're going to mean the same thing. All right, with the next picture here, we have triangle DCB is congruent to triangle CDQ. So we want to know what's congruent to segment CB. All right, again, the second and third letter. So we're going to find the second and third letter, and that would tell us it's DQ. All right, and don't forget to put that segment line over the top. And let's double check with our picture. So segment CB is right here. That has two lines through it, and we're looking for the other triangle, part of the triangle, that has two lines. And that would again be DQ. All right, now when we are naming this, you may want to write QD, but that's actually not correct because we want to look at the number of lines through each angle. So where the statement that we started with was CB, it went from the angle, the C angle that had two lines through it, to angle B that had three lines through it. All right, we want to keep in that same order. So angle D has the two lines through its angle, and angle Q has the three lines. So that's why we go in that order. All right, and lastly, we're just going to mark up these triangles to show the congruent pieces. So I'm going to actually pick two different colors to use, one for my angles, one for my sides, and I'm going to start with my angles. So angles L and X are the first letters. So those are going to be congruent to each other. So I'm going to put one curved marking through that angle. All right, next I have angle K and V. Those are the two middle ones. So those are going to be congruent to each other. So I'm going to put two lines through them to make it different from the first set of congruent angles. And then lastly, I have J and W. And I'm going to put three lines through that to signify that those two angles are congruent to each other. All right, so now I'm going to look at the sides. All right, so I have LK, and that matches up with the first two letters of XV. So LK, I'm going to put one line through that side, and that matches up with XV. I'm going to put one line through that side. All right, next we have KJ, second and third letter, and VW, second and third letter. So I'm going to put two lines through each of those segments. And then lastly, we have the first and last letter in each triangle. So LJ and XW. All right, so I'm going to put three lines through those sides. And the only reason I changed the color there was because I wanted you to see me drawing kind of the little brackets below those letters. All right, so that's how we can represent things in our triangles using our congruence statements. And I'm going to do the same thing one more time over here. All right, so again, angles B and B. All right, so what's happening here is we have a shared point on our triangles, and that will happen quite often. So that just means that these angles B are congruent to each other. Then we have angle C and angle J. I'm going to put two lines through there, and then angle A and angle I. I'm going to put three lines through there. All right, and then next I'm going to go through my sides. So BC matches up with BJ. So BC, BJ, and then I have CA and JI. So So CA, I'm going to put 2 lines through. JI, I'm going to put 2 lines through. And then the last combination is BA and BI. All right, and that shows again all of our congruent parts of these congruent triangles. So again, you can look at the congruent statement or a picture, and both of these are going to give you the same information. Sometimes you're going to need to use both pieces to help you figure out whatever you're going to need to solve for.